Okay, so Heidegger is by far my favorite philosopher. Not because I know what any of it means, but because I don't know what any of it means. So, this is the first 50 pages of an annotated audiobook. Uh, and I just did Being in Time, PDF, and I clicked the first link, uh, dedicated to Edmund Husserl. Husserl sounds familiar. So there's translator's preface, author's preface to the 7th German edition, introduction, exposition of the question of the meaning of being. 1. The necessity, structure, and priority of the question of being. Number 1. The necessity for explicitly restating the question of being. Arabic number 2. The formal structure of the question of being. Number 3. The ontological priority of the question of being. Number 4, the ontological priority of the question of being. Roman numeral 2, the twofold task in working out the question of being, method, and design of our investigation. 5, the ontological analytic of Dasein is laying bare the horizon for an interpretation of the meaning of being in general. 6, the task of destroying the history of ontology. 7, the phenomenological method of investigation. A, the concept of phenomenon. B, the concept of the logos. C, the preliminary concept of phenomenology. 8, design of the treatise. Then part 1, which I don't think I'll get to. So I'm just gonna start reading till like page 50. Table. More than 30 years have passed since Being in Time first appeared, and it has now become perhaps the most celebrated philosophical work which Germany has produced in this century. It is a very difficult book even for the German reader and highly resistant to translation, so much so that it has been often called untranslatable. We feel that this is an exaggeration. Anyone who has struggled with a philosophical work in translation has constantly found himself asking how the author himself would have expressed the ideas which the translator has ascribed to him. In this respect, the ideal translation would perhaps be one so constructed that a reader with reasonable linguistic competence and a key to the translator's conventions should be able to retranslate the new version into the very words of the original, the very words. Everybody knows that this is altogether too much to demand, but the faithful translator must at least keep this ahead of him as a desirable, though impracticable, goal. The simplest compromise with the demands of his own language is to present the translation and the original text on opposite pages. He is then quite free to choose the most felicitous expressions he can think of, trusting that the reader who is shrewd enough to wonder what is really happening can look across and find out. Such a procedure would add enormously to the expense of a book as long as Being in Time, and is impracticable for other reasons. But on any page of Heidegger, there is a great deal happening, and we have felt that we owe it to the reader to let him know what is going on. For the benefit of the man who already has a copy of the German text, we have indicated in our margins the pagination of the later German editions, which differs only slightly from that of the earlier ones. All citations marked with H refer to this pagination, but for the reader who does not have the German text handy, we have had to use other devices. So this, I'm sort of skeptical of the transversal, how unoptionable that is from German to English. I know that German has a really weird sentence structure, as noted by Mark Twain. You could look up Mark Twain German sentence structure, but this focuses seemingly more on words in the translation of apparent terms, which I suppose would be the most compact structures. But I can't imagine how it wouldn't be very prompt to talk about the sentence structure more, because how much can you really pack linguistically into words such that they mean something very different? Like, for instance, the Japanese word moe, or the Japanese word wabi sabi, whatever Japanese word you want to come up with, and sort of trying to be like, what precisely does that mean? but its imprecision is perhaps what makes it just hyper digestible, hyper metabolic. So yeah, I mean, it's a bit of a much ado about nothing, and it's all memes. Uh, as long as an author is using words in their ordinary ways, the translator should not have had much trouble in showing what he is trying to say. But Heidegger is constantly using words in ways which are by no means ordinary, and a great part of his merit lies in the freshness and penetration which his very innovations reflect. He tends to discard much of the traditional philosophical terminology, substituting an elaborate vocabulary of his own. He occasionally coins new expressions from older roots, and he takes full advantage of the ease with which the German language lends itself to the formation of new compounds. He also uses familiar expressions in new ways. Adverbs, prepositions, pronouns, conjunctions are made to do service as nouns. Words which have undergone a long history of semantical change are used afresh in their older senses. Specialized modern idioms are generalized far beyond the limits within which they would ordinarily be applicable. Puns are by no means uncommon, and frequently a keyword may be used in several senses, successively or even simultaneously. He is especially fond of ringing the changes on words with a common stem or a common prefix. He tends on the whole to avoid personal constructions and often uses abstract nouns, Dasein, Zeitlichkeit, Sorge, in der Welt sein, and so forth, as subjects of sentences where a personal subject would ordinarily be found, like Aristotle or Wittgenstein. He likes to talk about his words, and seldom makes an innovation without explaining it, but sometimes he will have used a word in a special sense many times before he gets round to the explanation, and he may often use it in the ordinary senses as well. In such cases, the reader is surely entitled to know what word Heidegger is actually talking about, as well as what he says about it. And he's also entitled to know when and how he actually uses it. So, really appropriate to the way people talk nowadays. I mean, I don't think it's at all strange to have people say something in an ordinary way, then realize how, oh, I can say that in a meme review. So, I don't really get the uh, ridicule or abstruse. Why? We have tried in the main to keep our vocabulary under control, providing a German English glossary for the more important expressions in a rather full analytical index, which will also serve as an English-German glossary. We have tried to use as few English terms as possible to represent the more important German ones, and we have tried not to use these for other purposes than those we have specifically indicated. Sometimes we have had to coin new terms to correspond to Heidegger's. In a number of cases, there are two German terms at the author's disposal which he has chosen to differentiate, even though they may be synonyms in ordinary German usage. If we have found only one suitable English term to correspond to them, we have sometimes adopted the device of capitalizing it when it represents a German word to which it is etymologically closer. Thus, Auslegen becomes interpret, but interpretieren becomes interpret with a capital I. Gliedern becomes articulate, but articulieren becomes articulate, capital. Ding becomes thing, but thing represents Sache. So, closer, sounding, capital, and a number of other expressions. In other cases, we have coined a new term. Thus, while tatsächlich becomes factual, we have introduced factical to represent faktisch. We have often inserted German expressions in square brackets on the occasions of their first appearance, or on that of their official definition. But we have also used bracketed expressions to call attention to departures from our usual conventions, or to bring out etymological connections which might otherwise be overlooked. In many cases, bracketing is insufficient, and we have introduced footnotes of our own, discussing some of the more important terms on the occasion of their first appearance. We have not hesitated to quote German sentences at length when they have been ambiguous or obscure, while we have sometimes taken pains to show where the ambiguity lies. We have more often left this to the reader to puzzle out for himself. We have often quoted passages with verbal subtleties which would otherwise be lost in translation. We have also called attention to a number of significant differences between the earlier and later editions of Heidegger's work. The entire book was reset for the 7th editions, while revisions were by no means extensive. They went beyond the simple changes in punctuation and citation, which Heidegger mentions in his preface. We have chosen the 3rd edition, 1931, as typical of the earlier editions, and the 8th, 1957, as typical of the later ones. In general, we have preferred the readings of the 8th edition, and our marginal numbering and cross-references follow its pagination. Heidegger's very valuable footnotes have been renumbered with Roman numerals and placed at the end of the text, where we trust they will be given the attention they deserve. Hoping that our own notes will be of immediate use to the reader, we have placed them at the bottoms of pages for easy reference, indicating them with Arabic numerals. In general, we have tried to stick to the text as closely as we can without sacrificing intelligibility, but we have made numerous concessions to the reader at the expense of making Heidegger less Heideggerian. We have, for instance, frequently used personal constructions where Heidegger has avoided him. We have also tried to be reasonably flexible in dealing with hyphenated expressions. Heidegger does not seem to be especially consistent in his use of quotation marks, though in certain expressions, for instance, the word welt, they are very deliberately employed. Except in a few footnote references and some of the quotations from Hegel and Count York in the 2 concluding chapters, our single quotation marks represent Heidegger's double ones. We have felt free to introduce double ones of our own wherever we feel that they may be helpful to the reader. We have followed a similar policy with regard to italicization. When Heidegger uses italics in the later editions, or space type in the earlier ones, we have generally used italics. But in the relatively few cases where we have felt that some emphasis of our own is needed, we have resorted to wide spacing. We have not followed Heidegger in the use of italics for proper names, or for definite articles used demonstratively to introduce restrictive relative clauses. But we have followed the usual practice of italicizing words and phrases from languages other than English in German, and have italicized titles of books regardless of Heidegger's procedure. We have received help from several sources. Miss Marjorie Ward has collated the 3rd and 8th editions and made an extremely careful study of Heidegger's vocabulary and ours, which has saved us from innumerable inconsistencies and many downright mistakes. There is hardly a page which has not profited by our assistance. We are also indebted to several persons who have helped us in various ways. Z. Adamszewski, Hannah Arendt, J. A. Berzel, C. A. Campbell, G. M. George, Fritz Heider, Edith Kern, Norbert Raymond, Ava Schaper, Martin Shearer, John Wilde. If any serious errors remain, they are probably due to our failure to exploit the time and good nature of these friends and colleagues more unmercifully. We are particularly indebted to Professor R. Gregor Smith, who brought us together in the first place, and who perhaps more than anyone else has made it possible for this translation to be presented to the public. We also wish to express our appreciation to our publishers and to Max Niemeyer Verlag, holders of the German copyright, who have shown extraordinary patience in putting up with a long delay in our preparation of our manuscript. We are particularly grateful to the University of Kansas for generous research grants over a period of 3 years, and to the University of Kansas Endowment Association for enabling us to work together in Scotland. Author's preface to the 7th German edition. This treatise first appeared in the spring of 1927 in the Fachbuch für Phänomenologie und Phänomenologische Forschung, edited by Edmund Husserl, and was published simultaneously in a special printing. The present reprint, which appears as the 7th edition, is unchanged in the text, but has been newly revised with regard to quotations and punctuation. The page numbers of this reprint agree with those of the earlier editions except for minor deviations. While the previous editions have borne the designation first half, this has now been deleted. After a quarter of a century, the second half could no longer be added unless the first were to be presented anew. Yet the road it has taken remains even today a necessary one, if our Dasein is to be stirred by the question of being. For the elucidation of this question, the reader may refer to my Einführung in die Metaphysik, which is appearing simultaneously with the reprinting under the same publisher. This work presents the text of a course of lectures delivered in the summer semester of 1935. So, in general, I don't really feel like many books are well collated. Like the introduction, it's just everything stuffed and everything, so you have to like note each individual thing. Some sentences even, like you read past the commas, and the rhythm of them is such that you don't really know how to like, if you were running, you can like get one good stroke in, but the next stroke is bad. So it's sort of like that with sentences, and that's my general frustration with books and why I don't read at all, because books suck. Because books are this like structure into structure into structure similar to reality itself, which is why you can find much literary stuff and how things work, because it's very much in that sort of non-serialized but massive way and sort of epic way, which is also repetitive and transcontextual. Being in time, some Greek stuff, and quote, "For manifestly you have long been aware of what you mean when you use the expression being. We, however, who used to think we understood it, have now become perplexed." So I think being is understandably this thing where it's a verb which can't not be. Like running cannot be, but being cannot be. So is being a noun, but if being was a noun, then you could have other nouns which aren't being, so it doesn't describe that either. And that's a translation of the Greek shit. Do we, in our time, have an answer to the question of what we really mean by the word being? Not at all. So it is fitting that we should raise anew the question of the meaning of being. But are we nowadays even perplexed at our inability to understand the expression being? Not at all. So first of all, we must reawaken an understanding for the meaning of this question. Our aim in the following treatise is to work at the question of the meaning of being, and to do so concretely. Our provisional aim is the interpretation of time as the possible horizon for any understanding whatsoever of being. Provisional, I don't know what words mean. Provisional, arranged or existing for the present, possibly to be changed by it. Being and time. So time is provisional, time is suited to it. Time is the hypothesis. Because time, I guess, is something that's neither a noun nor a verb, but in a different way. I don't know. Relating to the unofficial wings of the Irish Republican Army and Sinn Féin established in 1969 and advocating terrorism. I'm sure that's what he means. But the reasons for making this our aim, the investigations which such a purpose requires, and the path to its achievement call for some introductory remarks. So a provisional aim, I guess, is necessary because, exactly because it's not necessary, because it's sort of a provision. Annotation 1 for being, I think. Sayend, Heidegger translates Plato's present participle by this present participle of the verb sein, to be. We accordingly translate sayend here, and in a number of later passages, by the present being, which, where such a translation is inconvenient, we shall resort to other constructions, usually subjoining the German word in brackets or in a footnote. The participle sayend must be distinguished from the infinitive sein, which we shall usually translate either by the infinitive to be or by the gerund being. It must also be distinguished from the important substantive sein, always capitalized, which we shall translate as being, and from the equally important substantive sayendus, which is directly derived from sayend, and which we shall usually translate as entity or entities. 2, and this is the annotation for meaning, question of the meaning. In view of the importance of the distinction between Sinn and Bedeutung in German writers as diverse as Dilthey, Husserl, Frege, Schlick, we shall translate Sinn by meaning or sense, depending on the context, and keep signification and signify for Bedeutung and Bedeutin. The verb mean will occasionally be used to translate such verbs as besagen, sagen, heißen, and meinen, but the noun meaning will be reserved for Sinn. On Sinn, see H. Then annotation 3 for interpretation. Heidegger uses two words which might well be translated as interpretation, Auslegung and interpretation. Though in many cases there may be regarded as synonyms, their connotations are not quite the same. Auslegung seems to be used in a broad sense to cover any activity in which we interpret something as something, whereas interpretation seems to apply to interpretations which are more theoretical or systematic, as in the exegesis of a text. See especially H148 and 199. We shall preserve this distinction by writing interpretation for Auslegung, but interpretation for Heidegger's interpretation, following similar conventions for the verbs auslegen and interpretieren. So that's like interpretation as a worldly thing versus interpretation as an abstract thing. I'm not getting any of this other stuff. Bedeutung, signification, verbs. Then footnote 4 for being. Als des möglichen Horizontes eines jeden Sehnsverstandnisses überhaupt. Throughout this work, the word horizon is used with the connotation somewhat different from that to which the English speaker is likely to be accustomed. We tend to think of a horizon as something which we may widen or extend or go beyond. Heidegger, however, seems to think of it rather as something which we can neither widen nor go beyond, but which provides the limits for certain intellectual activities performed within it. I mean, that makes sense to me. Um, I guess it's connotative, shapely, purely, so I might not think that way. Introduction. Exposition of the question of the meaning of being. 1. The necessity, structure, and priority of the question of being. What's that backwards P thing? Necessity of explicitly restating the question of being. Man. This question has today been forgotten, even though in our time we deem it progressive to give our approval to metaphysics again. It is held that we have been exempted from the questions of newly rekindled Greek shit. Yet the question we are touching upon is not just any question. It is one which provided a stimulus for the researches of Plato and Aristotle, only to subside from them on as a theme for actual investigation. What these two men achieved was to persist through many alterations and retouchings down to the logic of Hegel, and what they wrested from with the utmost intellectual effort from the phenomena, fragmentary and incipient though it was, has long since become trivialized. Incipient. In an initial stage beginning to happen or develop, so transitory. You could say, what was that? Revisionary? What is the word I looked up before, you bitch? Combined. Provisional. It's sort of provisional. Not only that, on the basis of the Greeks' initial contributions toward an interpretation of being, a dogma has been developed which not only declares the question about the meaning of being to be superfluous, but sanctions its complete neglect. It is said that being is the most universal and the emptiest of concepts. Is fast? It is said that being is the most universal and the emptiest of concepts. As such, it resists every attempt at definition. Nor does this most universal and hence indefinable concept require any definition, for everyone uses it constantly and already understands what he means by it. So it's a sort of utilitarian thing where the utility is sort of prefigured. In this way, that which the ancient philosophers found continually disturbing as something obscure and hidden has taken on a clarity and self-evidence such that if anyone continues to ask about it, he is charged with an error of method. I'm always really angered by that. At the beginning of our investigation, it is not possible to give a detailed account of the presuppositions and prejudices which are constantly reimplanting and fostering the belief that an inquiry into being is unnecessary. It do be like that sometimes. The footnote on that page was regarding only to subside from them on as a theme for actual investigation. Als thematische Frage wirklicher Untersuchung. When Heidegger speaks of a question as thematisch, he thinks of it as one which is taken seriously and studied in a systematic manner. While we shall often translate this adjective by its cognate thematic, we may sometimes find it convenient to choose more flexible expressions involving the word theme. I don't know what that means. Are they saying it's good or it's bad to them? Uh, a theme for actual investigation. It seems pejorative. Um, At the beginning of our investigation, it is not possible to give a detailed account of the presuppositions and prejudices which are constantly reimplanting and fostering the belief that an inquiry into being is unnecessary. Wow. They are rooted in ancient ontology itself, and it will not be possible to interpret that ontology adequately until the question of being has been clarified and answered and taken as a clue. At least, if we are to have regard for the soil from which the basic ontological concepts developed, and if we are to see whether the categories have been demonstrated in a way that is appropriate and complete. We shall therefore carry the discussion of these presuppositions only to the point at which the necessity for restating the question about the meaning of being become plain. Fucking Christ. So he's basically saying that too much ontology becomes a utilization of the word being, but it doesn't really stay true to the nature of being. You can have any study, but your utilization of it breaks down your actual understanding of the study. You know, only perfect practice makes perfect, basically. And regarding ontology as a net for being in different forms, it sort of privates a bunch of different stuff, I guess I'd say. That's kind of how I interpret it. But it's good to separate the study of something from the actual something, I guess. And I suppose that's what he means to say when he emphasizes how it's a failure of method to probe into whatever he's saying. There are three such presuppositions. First, it has been maintained that being is the most universal concept. Some Greek shit. Illud quod primo cadit sub apprehension est ins quis intellectus includitur in omnibus quaecumque quis apprehendit. An understanding of being is already included in conceiving anything which one apprehends as an entity. But the universality of being is not that of a class or genus. The term being does not define that realm of entities which is uppermost when these are articulated conceptually according to genus and species. Some Greek shit. The universality of being transcends any universality of genus. So, like a person, a universe, I guess. In medieval ontology, being is designated as transcendence. Aristotle himself knew the unity of this transcendental universal as a unity of analogy in contrast to the multiplicity of the highest generic concepts applicable to things. With this discovery, in spite of his dependence on the way in which the ontological question had been formulated by Plato, he put the problem of being on what was, in principle, a new basis. To be sure, even Aristotle failed to clear away the darkness of these categorical interconnections. In medieval ontology, this problem was widely discussed, especially in the Thomist and Scottist schools, without reaching clarity as to principles. And when Hegel at last defines being as the indeterminate immediate and makes this and makes this definition basic for all the further categorical explications of his logic, he keeps looking in the same direction as ancient ontology. More of the same sounding stuff. Annotation 1 for entity as an understanding of being is already included in conceiving anything which one apprehends as an entity. Was einer am Sehenden erfasst. The word Sehendus, which Heidegger uses in his paraphrase, is one of the most important words in this book. The substantive das Sehende, substantive, that's a tense of noun. German has those. What? Substantive case. Second objects. A case of second objects being a derivation of the comparative case, but intended for larger, more substantial objects, and used to join or combine one thing for another with another. Oh, so a substance of something. I see. The substantive das Sehende is derived from the participle siend and means literally that which is. Ein Sehendes means something which is. There is much to be said for translating Sehendes by the noun being or beings, for it is often used in a collective sense. We feel, however, that it is smoother and less confusing to write entity or entities. We are well aware that in recent British and American philosophy, the term entity has been used more generically to apply to almost anything whatsoever, no matter what its ontological status. In this translation, however, it will mean simply something which is. So, substantive. An alternative translation of the Latin quotation is given by the English Dominican Fathers. Summa Theologica, Thomas Baker, London, 1915, for that which before aught else falls upon apprehension, is being, the notion of which is included in all things whatsoever a man apprehends. In medieval ontology, this problem was widely discussed, especially in the Thomist and Scottish schools, without reaching clarity as to principles. And when Hegel at last defines being as the indeterminate immediate and makes this definition basic for all the further categorical explications of his logic, he keeps looking in the same direction as ancient ontology, except that he no longer pays heed to Aristotle's problem of the unity of being, as over against the multiplicity of categories applicable to things. So if it is said that being is the most universal concept, this cannot mean that it is the one which is clearest, or that it needs no further discussion. It is rather the darkest of all. 2. It has been maintained, secondly, that the concept of being is indefinable. This is deduced from its supreme universality, and rightly so, if definitio fit per genus proximum et differentium specificam, being cannot indeed be conceived as an entity, enti non additur aliqua natura, nor can it acquire such a character as to have the term entity applied to it. Being cannot be derived from higher concepts by definition, nor can it be presented through lower ones. But does this imply that being no longer offers a problem? Not at all. We can infer only that being cannot have the character of an entity. Thus, we cannot apply to being the concept of definition as presented in traditional logic, which itself has its foundations in ancient ontology and which within certain limits provides a quite justifiable way of defining entities. The indefinability of being does not eliminate the question of its meaning. It demands that we look that question in its face. Thirdly, it is held that being is of all concepts the one that is self-evident. Whenever one cognizes anything or makes an assertion, whenever one comports oneself towards entities, even towards oneself, some use is made of being, and this expression is held to be intelligible without further ado. Just as everyone understands the sky is blue, I am merry, and the like, but here we have an average kind of intelligibility, which merely demonstrates that this is unintelligible. It makes manifest that in any way of comporting oneself towards entities as entities, even in any being towards entities as entities, there lies a priori an enigma. The very fact that we already live in an understanding of being, and that the meaning of being is still veiled in darkness, proves that it is necessary in principle to raise this question again. Footnote 1 is for ooh, damn. This is impossible to read. Somewhere earlier, even towards oneself. In hedem verhalten zu seendem, in hedem sich zu sich selber verhalten. The verb verhalten can refer to any kind of behavior or way of conducting oneself, even to the way in which one relates oneself to something else, or to the way one refrains or holds oneself back. We shall translate it in various ways. 2. There lies a priori an enigma. Sie macht offenbar das in jedem Verhalten und sen zu sehendem als sendem a priori ein Rätsel liegt. The phrase sen zu sehendem is typical of many similar expressions in which the substantive sen is followed by the preposition zu. In such expressions, we shall usually translate zu as towards, for example, being towards death, being towards others, being towards entities within the world. Three is Kant's covert. Within the range of basic philosophical concepts, especially when we come to the concept of being, is a dubious procedure to invoke self-evidence even as if the self-evident, Kant's covert judgments of the common reason, die geheimen Urteil der gemeinen Vernunft. Does that continue on the next page? No. Even if self-evident is to become the sole explicit and abiding theme for one's analytic, the business of philosophers. By considering these prejudices, however, we have made plain not only that the question of being lacks an answer, but that the question itself is obscure and without direction. So, if it is to be revived, this means that we must first work out an adequate way of formulating it. And so, those are the three assumptions. That's good. I assumed that too. Now, who wouldn't? Yo, homies, are you ready to become a fascist? I'm a skinhead, right? Going by appearances. Look into the mirror and shit. Reading is worse than doing cocaine. Hmm. The fuck? Is this page 5? I don't even know. It's page 23, but it also says 5. I don't get this. Fucking bullshit formatting. Have one number. One number on the page. Don't have two. You can have a part. It says int 1. Part 1 of the introduction. The formal structure of the question of being. 2. The question of the meaning of being must be formulated. If it is a fundamental question, or indeed the fundamental question, it must be made transparent and in an appropriate way. We must therefore explain briefly what belongs to any question whatsoever, so that from this standpoint, the question of being can be made visible as a very special one, with its own distinct. So I think this is him basically like making ontology for questions, which is, you know, where they need to be, in like indefinite things, instead of just making reality a question. Every inquiry is a seeking, sushin. Every seeking gets guided beforehand by what is sought. You know, the where there's a widow, there's a way. Inquiry is a cognizant seeking for an entity both with regard to the fact that it is and with regard to its being as it is. So you don't just ask, like, why is that thing there, but you're also asking, you're not just asking about why it's there, you're also asking about the thing. And you're also asking, if you're asking, why is that milk there? You're not just asking about milk, you're also asking why it's there. Inquiry is a cognizant seeking for an entity both with regard to the fact that it is and with regard to its being as it is. This cognizant seeking can take the form of investigating, Untersuchen, in which one lays bare that which the question is about and ascertains its character. Any inquiry as an inquiry about something has that which is asked about, sem gefragtes. But all inquiry about something is somehow a questioning of something, anfragende. So in addition to what is asked about, an inquiry has that which is interrogated, ein befragtes. In investigative questions, that is, in questions which are specifically theoretical. What is asked about is determined and conceptualized. Furthermore, in what is asked about, there lies also that which is to be found out by the asking, das Erfragte. You already said das Erfragte. Oh, gefragtes, Erfragte. One of those different noun cases, prepositions. That is what is really intended. With this, the inquiry reaches its goal. Inquiry itself is the behavior of a questioner, and therefore of an entity, and as such has its own character of being. When one makes an inquiry, one may do so just casually, or one may formulate the question explicitly. The latter case is peculiar in that the inquiry does not become transparent to itself until all these constitutive factors of the question have themselves become transparent. Sure. It must be made transparent and in an appropriate way. Footnote 1. Dann bedarf solches Fragen der angemessenen Durchsichtigkeit, the adjective durchsichtig, is one of Heidegger's favorite expressions and means simply transparent, perspicuous, something that is both something that one can see through. We shall ordinarily translate it by transparent. See H146 for further discussion. 2. Being as it is, with regard to the fact that it is, and with regard to its being as it is. Das eigentlich intendierte. The adverb eigentlich often occurs very often in his word. Wait, no. That's 2. In seinem Das und so sein. Suggest a direct translation. In what is asked about, there lies also that which is to be found out by the asking. Das Erfragte. This is what is really intended. Footnote 3. Das eigentlich intendierte. The adverb eigentlich occurs very often in this work. It may be used informally where one might write really or on its part, or in a much stronger sense, where something like genuinely or authentically would be more appropriate. It is not always possible to tell which meaning Heidegger has in mind. In the contexts which seem relatively informal, we shall write really. In the more technical passages, we shall write authentically, reserving genuinely for genuine or echt. The reader must not confuse this kind of authenticity with a kind which belongs to an authentic text or an authentic account. See H42 for further discussion. In the present passage, the verb intendieren is presumably used in the medieval sense of intending, as adapted and modified by Brentano and Hasso. So again, in what is asked about, there lies also that which is to be found out by the asking. Das Erfragte, that this is what is really intended. Really intended. Bullshit. The question about the meaning of being is to be formulated. We must therefore discuss it with an eye to the structural items. Inquiry as a kind of seeking must be guided by what is sought. Really. Really. So the meaning of being must already be available to us in some way, as we have intimated. We always conduct our activities in an understanding of being. Out of this understanding arise both the explicit question of the meaning of being and the tendency that leads us towards its conception. We do not know what being means, but even if we ask what is being, we keep within an understanding of the is, though we are unable to fix conceptually what the is signifies. We do not even know the horizon in terms of which that meaning is to be grasped and fixed, but this vague average understanding of being is still a fact. However much this understanding of being, an understanding which is already available to us, may fluctuate and grow dim and border on mere acquaintance with a word, its very indefiniteness is itself a positive phenomenon which needs to be clarified. An investigation of the meaning of being cannot be expected to give this clarification at the outset. If we are to obtain the clue we need for interpreting the average understanding of being, we must first develop the concept of being. In the light of this concept, in the ways in which it may be explicitly understood, we can make out what this obscured or still unillumined understanding of being means, and what kinds of obscuration or hindrance to an explicit illumination of the meaning of being are possible and even inevitable. Further, this vague average understanding of being may be so infiltrated with the traditional theories and opinions about being that these remain hidden as sources of the way in which it is prevalently understood. What we seek when we inquire into being is not something entirely unfamiliar, even if proximally. We cannot grasp it at all. proximally. Zuna footnote 1. This word is of very frequent occurrence in Heidegger, and he will discuss his use of it on page 370 below. In ordinary German usage, the word may mean at first, to begin with, or in the first instance. And we shall often translate it in such ways. The word is, however, cognate with the adjective nah and its superlative nacht, which we shall usually translate as close and closest, respectively. And Heidegger often uses zu nacht in the sense of most clearly when he is describing the most natural and obvious experiences which we have at an uncritical and pre-philosophical level. We have ventured to translate this Heideggerian sense of zu nacht as proximally, but there are many borderline cases where it is not clear whether Heidegger has in mind this special sense or one of the more general usages. In such cases, we have chosen whatever expression seems to be stylistically preferable. In the question which we are to work out, what is asked about is being. Being, that which determines entities as entities, that on the basis of which, woraufhin, entities are already understood. However, we may discuss them in detail. The being of entities is not itself an entity. If we are to understand the problem of being, our first philosophical step consists in not Greek shit, in not telling a story, that is to say, in not defining entities as entities by tracing them back in their origin to some other entities as if being, no. Being had the character of some possible entity. Hence, being, as that which is asked about, must be exhibited in a way of its own, essentially different from the way in which entities are discovered. Accordingly, what is to be found out by the asking, the meaning of being, also demands that it be conceived in a way of its own, essentially contrasting with the concepts in which entities acquire their determinate signification. Insofar as being constitutes what is asked about, and being means the being of entities, then entities themselves turn out to be what is interrogated. These are, so to speak, questioned as regards their being. But if the characteristics of their being can be yielded without falsification, then these entities must on their part have become accessible as they are in themselves. When we come to what it is to be interrogated, the question of being requires that the right way of access to entities shall have been obtained and secured in advance. But there are many things which we designate as being, and we do so in various senses. Everything we talk about, everything we have in view, everything towards which we comport ourselves in any way is being. What we are is being, and so is how we are. Being lies in the fact that something is, and in its being as it is in reality, in presence at hand, in subsistence, in validity, in Dasein, in the there is, in which entities is the meaning of being to be discerned, from which entities is the disclosure of being to take its departure. Is the starting point optional, or does some particular entity have priority when we come to work out the question of being? Which entity shall we take for our example, and in what sense does it have priority? If the question of being is to be explicitly formulated and carried through in such a manner as to be completely transparent to itself, then any treatment of it in line with the elucidations we have given requires us to explain how being is to be looked at, how its meaning is to be understood and conceptually grasped. It requires us to prepare the way for choosing the right entity for our example and to work out the genuine way of access to it. Looking at something, understanding and conceiving it, choosing access to it, all these ways of behaving are constituted for our inquiry, and therefore are modes of being for those particular entities. Footnote 1 for... God fuck. Shit. Invalidity and Dasein in the there is. Sen liegt ihm das und so sein in Realität. Vorhandenheit Bestangetung. Dasein ihm es gibt an Vorhandenheit. Presence at hand. See note 1. Page 48. Page 25 on Dasein. See note. Oh, geez. And therefore are modes of being for those particular entities, which we the inquirers are ourselves. Thus, to work out the question of being adequately, we must make an entity, the inquirer, transparent in its own being. The very asking of this question is an entity's mode of being, and as such, it gets an essential character from what is inquired about, namely being. This entity, which each of us is himself, and which includes inquiring as one of the possibilities of its being, we shall denote by the term Dasein. If we are to formulate our question explicitly and transparently, we must first give a proper explication of an entity, Dasein, with regard to its being. Is it not, however, a manifest circularity in such an undertaking? If we must first define an entity and its being, if we want to formulate the question of being only on its basis, what is this but going in a circle? In working out a question, have we not presupposed something which only the answer can bring? Formal objections such as the argument about circular reasoning, which can easily be cited at any time in the study of first principles, are always sterile when one is considering concrete ways of investigating. When it comes to understanding the matter at hand, they carry no weight and keep us from penetrating into the field of study. But factically, there is no circle at all in formulating our question as we have described. One can determine the nature of entities and their being without necessarily having the explicit concept of the meaning of being at one's disposal. Otherwise, there could have been no ontological knowledge heretofore. One would hardly deny that factically there has been such knowledge. Of course, being has been presupposed in all ontology up till now, but not as a concept at one's disposal. Not as the sort of thing we are seeking. This presupposing of being has rather the character of taking a look at it beforehand, so that in the light of it, the entities presented to us get provisionally articulated in their being. This guiding, footnote 1 is this is the most... by the term Dasein. The word Dasein plays so important a role in this work and is already so familiar to the English-speaking reader who has read about Heidegger that it seems simpler to leave it untranslated except in the relatively rare passages in which Heidegger himself breaks it up with a hyphen, Dasein, to show its etymological construction, literally being there. Though in traditional German philosophy, it may be used quite generally to stand for almost any kind of being or existence, which we can say that something has the existence of God, for example. In everyday usage, it tends to be used more narrowly to stand for the kind of being that belongs to persons. Maybe I'll say being. Heidegger follows the everyday usage in this respect, but goes somewhat further in that he often uses it to stand for any person who has such being, and who is thus an entity himself. Footnote 2, but factically, factisch, while this word can often be translated simply as in fact or as a matter of fact, it is used both as an adjective and as an adverb, and is so characteristic of Heidegger's style that we shall, as a rule, translate it either as factical or as factically, thus preserving its connection with the important noun facticitat, facticity, and keeping it distinct from tatsächlich, factual, and wirklich, actual. See the discussion of tatsächlich and facticitat, facticitat in sections 12 and 29 below. Then footnote 3. One would hardly deny that factically there has been such knowledge. Deren faktischen Bestand man wohl nicht leugnen wird. This guiding activity of taking a look at being arises from the average understanding of being in which we always operate and which, in the end, belongs to the essential constitution of Dasein itself. Such presupposing has nothing to do with laying down an axiom from which a sequence of propositions is deductively derived. It is quite impossible for there to be any circular argument in formulating the question about the meaning of being. For in answering this question, the issue is not one of grounding something by such a derivation, it is rather one of laying bare the grounds for it and exhibiting them. Makes sort of sense. Footnote. In the question of the meaning of being, there is no circular reasoning, but rather a remarkable relatedness backward and forward, which what we are asking about being bears to the inquiry itself as a mode of being, of an entity. Here, what is asked about has an essential pertinence to the inquiry itself, and this belongs to the ownmost meaning, Eigenstein's Sinn, of the question of being. This only means, however, that there is a way, perhaps even a very special one, in which entities with the character of Dasein are related to the question of being. Being. But have we not thus demonstrated that a certain kind of entity has a priority with regard to its being? And have we not presented thus that entity which shall serve as a primary example to be interrogated in the question of being? So far, the discussion has not demonstrated Dasein's priority, nor has it shown decisively whether Dasein may possibly or even necessarily serve as primary entity to be interrogated. But indeed, something like a priority of Dasein has announced itself. I sort of get what the fuck shit. Yeah. Footnote 1 for essential constitution, which in the end belongs to the essential constitution. Wissensverfassung. Verfassung is a standard word for the constitution of a nation or any political organization, but it is also used for the condition or state in which a person may find himself. Heidegger seldom uses the word in either of these senses, but he does use it in ways which are somewhat analogous. In one sense, Dasein's Verfassung is its constitution, the way it is constituted, sa condition humaine. In another sense, Dasein may have several Verfassungen as constitutive states or factors which enter its constitution. We shall in general translate Verfassung as constitution or constitutive state, according to the context. But in passages where constitutive state would be cumbersome and there is little danger of ambiguity, we shall simply write state. These states, however, must always be thought of as constitutive and essential, not as temporary or transitory states like the state of one's health or the state of the nation. When Heidegger uses the word constitution, we shall usually indicate this by capitalizing constitution. 2, that's for... It is rather one of laying bare the grounds for it and exhibiting them. While es in der Beantwortung der Frage nicht eine ableitende Begründung sondern aufweisende Grundverlängerung get, expression of the form es get appear very often in the work. We shall usually translate them by variants on is an issue for. Yep. How many fucking pages are 3? Am I on page 28 or page 7? It's not something wise. Page 28. Yeah, I'm not. So, those are parts of the book. What is fucking. Fuck reading. Reading sucks. Reading sucks. What was a phrase? I lost my place. It said, provisionary issue Constitution. How about Constitution with a K? I don't, can I even control F in here? I think I can. Uses the word Constitution. And I'm on page 28, 3, ontological priority of the question of being. Ontological, because we really wanted to know that when we got up. Yeah. So is that accurate to what these pages say? So in order to get through the introduction, I'd only have to get to page 67, which is what I thought. Yeah. This is where we go back. This is a part where we go back. It's just a judge. It's a judge work. Fuck. Anyone who does YouTube sacrifices more than anyone else. When the ontological priority of the question of being. Is that the right part? But I think I read, I read Constitution, so this page is, I'm going to go to the bathroom. Eat more milk. My bones gotta be strong. Reading is shit. Okay. Um, Reading is absolute shit, and reading fucking sucks. I hate it. It's garbage. Where's my fucking coat? Goddamn coat. Fuck. This is where we go back. You know, what I really have to criticize this book is for lack of transcontextual memes. And he doesn't talk about that place where people sing songs and shit. So you gotta dock a few points for that. So much fuzz. It's unrealistic. I guess I can bear having a bit of light. Yeah. Hours. You know, people's bodies exist. Fucking commentary. Bullshit. 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 7, 8. Yeah, language sucks. When we pointed out the characteristics of the question of being, taking as our clue the formal structure of the question as such, we made it clear that this question is a peculiar one, in that a series of fundamental considerations is required for working it out, not to mention for solving it, but its distinctive features will come fully to light only when we have delimited it adequately with regards to its function. That looks like 25 other words. You could make an adequate alphabet. Bullshit. Adequately? Who's inadequate? Oh, you just said adequate? No, I'm pretty sure I heard an in there. Fuck you. When we have delimited it adequately with regard to its function, its aim, and its motive. Hitherto, our arguments for showing that the question must be restated have been motivated in part by its venerable origin, but chiefly by the lack of a definite answer, and even by the absence of any satisfactory formulation of the question itself. One may, however, ask what purpose this question is supposed to serve. Does it simply remain, or is it at all a mere matter for soaring speculation about the most general of generalities? Or is it rather, of all questions, both the most basic and the most concrete? Being is always the being of being is always the being of an entity. The totality of entities can, in accordance with its various domains, become a field for laying bare the delimiting certain definite areas of subject matter. These areas, on their part, for instance, history, nature, space, life, Dasein, language, and the like, can serve as objects which corresponding scientific investigations may take as their respective themes. Scientific research accomplishes roughly and naively the demarcation and initial fixing of the areas of subject matter. The basic structures of any such area have already been worked out after a fashion in our pre-inside in interpreting that domain of being in which the area of subject matter is itself confined. Confined rather. The basic concepts which thus arise remain our proximal clues for disclosing this area concretely for the first time. And although research may always lean towards the positive approach, its real progress comes not so much from collecting results and storing them away in manuals, as from inquiring into the ways in which each particular area is basically constituted. Grundverfassungen, an inquiry to which we have been driven mostly by reacting against just such an increase in information. The real movement of the sciences takes place when their basic concepts undergo a more or less radical revision, which is transparent to itself. The level which a science has reached is determined by how far it is capable of a crisis in its basic concepts. In such imminent crises, the very relationship between positively investigative inquiry and those things themselves that are under interrogation comes to a point where it begins to totter. Among the various disciplines everywhere today, there are freshly awakened tendencies to put research on new foundations. Mathematics, which is seemingly the most rigorous and most firmly constructed of the sciences, has reached a crisis in its foundation. In the controversy between the formalists and the intuitionists, the issue is one of obtaining and securing the primary way of access to what are supposedly the objects of the science. The relativity theory of physics arises from the tendency to exhibit the interconnectedness of nature as it is in itself, as a theory of the conditions under which we have access to nature itself. It seeks to preserve the changelessness of the laws of motion by ascertaining all relativities, and thus comes up against the question of the structure of its own given area of study, the problem of matter. In biology, there is an awakened tendency to inquire beyond the definitions which mechanism and vitalism have given for life, an organism, and to define anew the kind of being which belongs to the living as such. In those humane sciences which are historiological in character, the urge towards historical actuality itself has been strengthened in the course of time by tradition, and by the way tradition has been presented and handed down. The history of literature is to become the history of problems. Theology is seeking a more primordial interpretation of a man's being towards God, prescribed by the meaning of faith itself and remaining within it. It is slowly beginning to understand once more Luther's insight that the foundation on which its system of dogma has not arisen from an inquiry in which faith is primary, and that conceptually this foundation not only is inadequate for the problematic of theology, but conceals and distorts it. Basic concepts determine the way in which we get an understanding beforehand of the area of subject matter underlying all the objects of science takes as its theme, and all positive investigation is guided by this understanding. Only after the area itself has been explored beforehand in a corresponding manner do these concepts become genuinely demonstrated and grounded. But since every such area is itself obtained from the domain of entities themselves, this preliminary research from which the basic concepts are drawn preliminary research oh god. This preliminary research from which the basic concepts are drawn signifies nothing else than an interpretation of those entities with regard to their basic state of being. Such research must run ahead of the positive sciences, and it can. Here, the work of Plato and Aristotle is evidence enough. Laying the foundations for the sciences in this way is different in principle from the kind of logic which limps along after investigating the status of some science as it chances to find it in order to discover its method. Laying the foundations, as we have described it, is rather a productive logic in the sense that it leaps ahead. This is for the ADD kids, yo. In those humane sciences which are historiological in character. 1. In den historischen Geisteswissenschaften, Heidegger makes much of a distinction between Historie and Geschichte, and the corresponding adjectives historisch and geschichtlich. History stands for what Heidegger calls a science of history. See H 375, 378. Geschichte usually stands for the kind of history that actually happens. We shall, as a rule, translate these respectively as historiology and history, following similar conventions and handling the two adjectives. The science of history. I think it's similar, the study of something versus the thing itself. Being an ontology. Yeah. Laying the foundations as we have described it is rather a productive logic in the sense that it leaps ahead, as it were, into some area of being, discloses it for the first time in the constitution of its being, and after thus arriving at the structures within it, makes these available to the positive sciences as transparent assignments for their inquiry. To give an example, what is philosophically primary is neither a theory of the concept formation of historiology, nor the theory of historiological knowledge, nor yet the theory of history as the object of historiology. What is primary is rather the interpretation of authentically historical entities as regards to their historicality. Similarly, the positive outcome of Kant's critique of pure reason lies in what it has contributed towards the working out of what belongs to any nature whatsoever, not in a theory of knowledge. That kind of makes sense. Not the philosophy isn't the compendium; it's the effect. It's the influences, not the thing itself. Similar to how there's sort of discussion in art around the actual thing versus the feeling it really gets you to convey, which is obvious when you consider that if you take any lick from something, you're less like, oh, that's good. So, though you might be like, oh, in a certain amount of time, I'd like it, still, there's a bunch of aspects which only exist in the human mind, which, similar to this, make it such that you can't really get an objective viewpoint, I guess. His transcendental logic is an a priori logic for the subject matter of that area of being called nature. Uh, but such an inquiry itself, ontology taken in the widest sense without favoring any particular ontological directions or tendencies, requires a further clue. Ontological inquiry is indeed more primordial, as over against the ontical inquiry, as over against the ontical inquiry of the positive sciences. Over against? What the fuck? But it remains itself naive and opaque in its, if in its researches into the being of entities. Being of entities, it fails to discuss the meaning of being in general. And even the ontological task of constructing a non-deductive genealogy of the different possible ways of being requires that we first come to an understanding of what we really mean by the expression being. Ugh. The question of being aims therefore at ascertaining the a priori conditions not only for the possibility of the sciences which examine entities as entities of such and such a type, and in so doing already operate with an understanding of being, but also for the possibility of those ontologies themselves which are prior to the ontical sciences and which provide their foundations. Basically, all ontology, no matter how rich and firmly compacted a system of categories it has at its disposal, remains blind and perverted from its own most aim, if it has not first adequately clarified the meaning of being and conceived this clarification as its fundamental task. Yeah, I think he's clarifying things. Ontological research itself, when properly understood, gives to the question of being an ontological priority, which goes beyond mere resumption of a venerable tradition and advancement with a problem that has hitherto been opaque. But this objectively scientific priority is not the only one. Footnote 1 makes these available to the positive sciences as transparent assignments for their inquiry. Als durchsichtig Anweisungen des Fragens. 2. What is primary is rather the interpretation of authentically historical entities as regards their historicality. Sondern die Interpretation des eigentlich geschichtlich Senden auf seine Geschichtlichkeit. We shall translate the frequently occurring term Geschichtlichkeit, Geschichtlichkeit as historicality. Heidegger very occasionally uses the term Historizität, as on H, 20 below, and this will be translated as historicity. That makes sense, like facticity. Oh, God. Historicity, historicality, it's not a good look. You should have thought before you said that. Requires a further clue. Ontological inquiry is indeed more primordial as over against the ontical. While the terms ontisch and ontologisch are not explicitly defined, their meanings will emerge rather clearly. Ontological inquiry is concerned primarily with being. Ontical inquiry is concerned primarily with entities and the facts about them. So it's like a more descriptive, more kind of a vernacular, I guess. Ontical, while ontical is more a floating point, sort of categorical, than ontological is more categorical, concerned with the categories themselves and the things in the category. Um, category. 4. The ontical priority of the question of being. Science in general may be defined as the totality. Science in general may be described as the totality established through an interconnection of true propositions. Yeah. The definition is not complete, nor does it reach the meaning of science as ways in which man behaves. Sciences have the manner of being which this entity, man himself, possesses. This entity we denote by the term Dasein. Scientific research is not the only manner of being which this entity can have, nor is it the one which lies closest. Moreover, Dasein itself has a special distinctiveness as compared with other entities, and it is worth our while to bring this to view in a provisional way. Here, our discussion must anticipate later analyses in which our results will be authentically exhibited for the first time. Dasein is an entity which does not just occur among other entities. Rather, it is ontically distinguished by the fact that, in its very being, that being is an issue for it. But in that case, this is a constitutive state of Dasein's being. Shut up! Shut up! Shut up! Shut up, Adam! Fucking you're shit at games! Fuck you! Dasein. Yeah, I get that. I get that vibe. Dasein don't fuck with no other homies. Yeah. Um. As a relation itself is one of being. And this means further that there is some way in which Dasein understands itself in its being. Wait. But in that case, this is the constitutive state of Dasein's being. And this implies that Dasein, in its being, has a relationship towards that being, a relationship which itself is one of being. And this means further that there is some way in which Dasein understands itself in its being, and that to some degree it does so explicitly. It is peculiar to this entity that with and through its being, this being is disclosed to it. Understanding of being is itself a definite characteristic of Dasein's being. Dasein is ontically distinctive in that it is ontological. Yeah. It's concerned with being and not just an entity. It's reflexive, which leads to a primitive, I guess, aesthetic. Here, being ontological is not yet tantamount to developing an ontology. So if we should reserve the term ontology for that theoretical inquiry, which is explicitly devoted to the meaning of entities, then what we have had in mind in speaking of Dasein's being ontological is to be designated as something pre-ontological. It does not signify simply being ontological. However, rather being, this is lowercase, being in such a way that one has an understanding of being. That kind of being towards what Dasein can comport itself in one way or another, and always does comport itself somehow, we call existence. Uh, Existence, like the Cronenberg movie. And because we cannot define Dasein's essence by citing a what of the kind that pertains to a subject matter, eines Sachhaltigen was, and because its essence lies rather in the fact that in each case it has its being to be, and has it as its own, we have chosen to designate this entity as Dasein, a term which is purely an expression of its being. I didn't pay attention in the first place to the difference between capital and not capital being, so I'll have to reconfigure that in my head. Configure it in the first place. Footnote 1. God, fuck. I want to kill myself. Existence. Oh, I can't. Existence. 1 is. Footnote 1 is. Science in general may be defined as the totality established through an interconnection of true propositions. Das Ganze eines Zusammenhanges war der Satze. See H357 below. 2. A relationship which itself is of being. Zu dieser Signs zu dieser Seinsverfassung des Daseins gehört aber dann, dass es in seinem Sein zu diesem Sein ein Seinsverhältnis hat. This passage is ambiguous and might also be read as, and this implies that Dasein in its being towards this being has a relationship of being, instead of Dasein in its being has a relationship towards that being, a relationship that which itself is one of being, instead of Dasein in its being towards this being has a relationship of being. I don't fucking know what you're talking about. 3. Understanding of being is itself a definite characteristic of Dasein's being. Dasein is ontically distinctive in that it is ontological. Das es ontologisch ist. As ontologisch may be either an adjective or an adverb, we might also write that it is ontologically. A similar ambiguity occurs in the 2 following sentences, where we read, ontologisch sein, and ontologisch sein, respectively. So I'm going to go back and read whatever in the introduction says. Being what I said earlier. Damn. Yeah. Smoke weed, dude. Smoke weed, dude. Smoke weed. Ding. Okay, so this is shit. This is such shit. Where can I find somewhere in the index or something? 503. What? There's only one 503? That's bullshit. About 5. My 2 doesn't work. And I love laptops. Being. Man, you're being a buzzkill. Depends on how you what the definition of ish. Depends on what the definition is. Bill Clinton, are you drunk? That depends on the drunk G.I. Joe. Man, he's a genius. You know his G.I. Joe. He does really know the kids. Just because I'm a pedophile. Did you just say you have a cell phone? Wow, nobody has a cell phone right now. It's the 90s. Yes, I'm a pedophile. Cheap shots, man. For manifestly, you have been long aware of what you mean when you use the expression being. We, however, who used to think we understood it, have now become perplexed. Do we in our time have an answer to the question of what we really mean by the word being? Not at all. So it is fitting that we should raise anew the question of the meaning of being. But are we nowadays even perplexed at our inability to understand the expression being? Not at all. Not at all. Not at all, I ask you. And the footnote says, signed. Heidegger translates Plato's present participle, but this present participle, the verb signed to be. We accordingly translate signed here, and in a number of later passages by the present participle being. Where such a translation is inconvenient, we shall resort to other constructions, usually subjoining the German word in brackets or in a footnote. The participle signed must be distinguished from the infinitive sign, which we shall usually translate either by the infinitive to be or by the gerund being. It must also be distinguished from the important substantive sign, always capitalized, which we shall translate as being capitalized, and from the equally important substantive sciendus, which is directly derived from signed, which we shall usually translate as entity or entities. What the fuck is a substantive? There's no such substantive definition. Noun. not needing a mordant, defining rights and duties as opposed to giving rules by which such things are established, having a separate and independent existence, having a firm basis in reality, and therefore important, meaningful, and considerable. But what the fuck does substantive mean? Independent existence, is that all? Substantive. Just a noun. You could say noun. The substantive das Seiende derives from the participle. Yeah, I feel like it's just a case. So, like, it's a substantive case of an adjective or a verb. But it only substantive. Uh, that which provides a substance. And substantive self. Substantivized particles such as das Besorte, the object of concern. I see. Well, that's bullshit. Istens. Pa 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 pa. Exposition? No, I don't need no exposition. No. Existence? That was a 5 minute aside, but I think we learned not much. But being is a thing, and being is a doing. Existence. Uh, existence. Existence. Is this 42? I was earlier than 42. Oh dear. Ah shit. Oh no! It's a holiday in Cambodia where you read being and time. It's a shit book for morons, and you're reading it too. Bobot. Uh, fuck. Shit. Bitch. Bagagnia? Did this bitch just say Bagagnia? Fucking Bagagnia? Uh, dongle, 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 Trump. Dongle, 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 Trump. Dongle Trump, dongle Trump, dongle, dongle, dongle Trump, dongle Trump, dongle Trump. Oh, I have to go way earlier. Right now I'm at 37/16, so I have to be at 32/12. Zu dieser existence, the fact that I would say that too. I get what he means. I feel ya. 33 existential. Ooh. But doesn't he say existens? Didn't I see existens? Does that not existens? And because its essence lies rather in the fact that in each case it has its being to be and has it as its own, we have chosen to designate this entity as Dasein, a term which is purely an expression of its being. Dasein it always understands itself in terms of existence, in terms of possibility of itself, to be itself or not itself, like Hamlet. Uh, that is the question. Dasein has either chosen these possibilities itself or got itself into them, or grown up in them already. Only the particular Dasein decides its existence, whether it does so by taking hold or by neglecting. The question of existence never gets straightened out except through existing itself. The understanding of oneself, which leads along this way, we call existential. And where does he say existens? Where does he say existens? Ontico-ontological priority? What the fuck is this bullshit? Fucking bullshit. I'm gonna fucking take a pipe to someone's fucking head. Like in the Grand Theft Auto. Passage is ambiguous. Maybe it said it in the main. I don't know. Science in general may be defined as a totality style. Yeah, I remember that. It's harder to read with lights on. It's less dangerous. Oh, yeah, it did say in the main text. Okay, so you should probably skip to. I don't know. Who fucking cares at this point? It's just a 10-minute waste of time and it's just random. Uh, that kind of being towards which Dasein can comport itself in one way or another and always does comport itself somehow we call existence or existens. And because we cannot define Dasein's essence by citing a what of the kind that pertains to a subject matter, eines Sachlagen or Sachalteigen was, and because its essence lies rather in the fact that in each case it has its being to be and has it as its own, we have chosen to designate this entity as Dasein, a term which is purely an expression of its being, als reiner Sesensausdruck. Being is a noun. Dasein always understands itself in terms of its existence, in terms of a possibility of itself, to be itself or not itself. Dasein has either chosen these possibilities itself or got itself into them, or grown up in them already. This is really ADD. Only the particular Dasein decides its existence, whether it does so by taking hold or by neglecting. The question of existence never gets straightened out except through existing itself. The understanding of oneself, which leads along this way, we call existential. The question of existence is one of Dasein's ontical affairs. This does not require that the ontological structure of existence should be theoretically transparent. Theoretically transparent. This is where we go. Only the particular Dasein decides its existence. Whether it does so by taking hold or by neglecting, the question of existence never gets straightened out except through existing itself. The understanding of oneself, which leads along this way, we call existentiel. The question of existence is one of Dasein's ontical affairs. This does not require that the ontological structure of existence should be theoretically transparent. The question about this structure aims at the analysis, Ausein an der Legung, of what constitutes existence. The context, das Zusammenhang, of such structures we call existentiality. Its analytic has the character of an understanding which is not existential, but rather existential. So not exist the understanding of what of oneself which leads along this way. The context Zusammenhang of such structures we call existentiality. Its analytic has the character of an understanding which is not existential, but rather existential, English word. The task of an existential analytic of Dasein has been delineated in advance as regards both its possibility and its necessity in Dasein's ontical constitution. So far as existence is the determining character in Dasein, the ontological analytic of this entity So far as existence is the determining character of Dasein, the ontological analytic of this entity always requires that existentiality be considered beforehand. By existentiality, we understand the state of being that is constitutive for those entities that exist. But in the idea of such a constitutive state of being, the idea of being is already included, and thus even the possibility of carrying through the analytic of Dasein depends on working out beforehand the question about the meaning of being in general. Sciences are ways of being in which Dasein comports itself towards entities which it need not be itself, but to Dasein, being in a world is something that belongs essentially. Thus, Dasein's understanding of being pertains with equal primordiality both to an understanding of something like a world and to the understanding of the being of those entities which become accessible within the world. So whenever an ontology takes for its theme entities whose character of being is other than that of Dasein, it has its own formation and motivation in Dasein's own ontical structure, in which a pre-ontological understanding of being is comprised as a definite characteristic. So before the knowledge of the thing is the recognition of the thing, or the setting of the thing with the self, and that is taken for granted. It's sort of like a object permanence, I guess you could say, in a simple way. Footnote 1 for has its being to be and has it as its own. Das es sein, ja, das es ja sein als seiniges zu sein hat. We shall translate existential by existential and existential by existential. There seems to be little reason for resorting to the more elaborate neologisms proposed by other writers. Yeah. Existential. I'll go on a quick. my idea of them is that existential ZL versus ZL is that ZL is regarding the uh, extensive nature of existence, and ZL is regarding the extensive, intensive rather. ZL is regarding the sort of moment to moment. Fucking Christ, you fucking piece of shit. Um, what did it say? Fucking tabs breaking down. And it's going to be at the beginning of this, so I'm going to have to go 33, right, is the page I was at. Then zoom down to the correct 333, which are 10. There you go. Fucking bitch. Fuck Christ. Existential refers to the aspects of the world that are identifiable as particular delimited questions or issues, whereas existential refers to being as such, which permeates all things, so to speak, and cannot be delimited in such a way as to be susceptible to factual knowledge. In general, it can be said that existential refers to a what, a material describable reality, whereas existential refers to structures inherent in any possible world. In other words, the term existential refers to an ontic determination, whereas existential refers to an ontological. Existential refers to an ontic determination, whereas existential refers to an ontological determination. So it's one is with regards to purely that uh, existence continually of a thing, and one is with regards to the providence and so on of a thing. Feels correct. Yeah, it's bullshit. Existential. With its possibility and its necessity and Daseins ontical constitution. Uh, we shall translate existentialium. Footnote 2. The understanding of oneself, uh, which leads along this way, we call existentiell. Innerhalb der Welt. Heidegger uses at least three expressions which might be translated as in the world, innerhalb der Welt, in der Welt, and the adjective or adverb innerweltlich. We shall translate these respectively by within the world, in the world, and within the world. The last one with dashes, so it's a whole thing, like a sickle mode. Therefore, fundamental ontology from which alone all other ontologies can take their rise must be sought in the existential analytic of Dasein. Dasein accordingly takes priority over all other entities in several ways. The first priority is an ontical one. Dasein is an entity whose being has a determinate character of existence. The second priority is an ontological one. Dasein is in itself ontological.
because existence is thus determinative for it. But with equal primordiality, Dasein also possesses, as constitutive for its understanding of existence, an understanding of the being of all entities of a character other than its own. Yeah, object permanence. Dasein has therefore a third priority as providing the ontico-ontological condition for the possibility of any ontologies. Thus, Dasein has turned out to be, more than any other entity, the one which must first be interrogated ontologically. But the roots of the existential analytic on his part are ultimately existential, that is, ontical. Only if the inquiry of philosophical research is itself seized upon in an existential manner as a possibility of the being of each existing Dasein, does it become at all possible to disclose the existentiality of existence. What? Existentiality, ontological, and to undertake an adequately founded ontological problematic. But with this, I don't know what problematic is supposed to mean. Maybe question approach? But with this, the ontical priority of the question of being has to become plain. Dasein's ontico-ontological priority was seen quite early, though Dasein itself was not grasped in its genuine ontological structure and did not even become a problem in which the structure was sought. Aristotle says, some Greek shit. Man's soul is, in a certain way, entities. The soul, which makes up the being of man, has some Greek shit and some Greek shit among its ways of being, and in these it discovers all entities, both in the fact that they are and in their being as they are. Yeah, it's sort of inside and outside. Inside. Blue is house, and the blue little windows. Everything he sees is blue. Looking for, I'm blue. If I'm blue, I was there. This is blue. Um. Uh, what? So yeah, both in an ontical and ontological. Is that what that means? I don't fucking know. Both in the fact that they are and in their being as they are. That is, so in them and of them. Uh, that is always in their being. Aristotle's principle, which points back to the ontological thesis of Parmenides, is one which Thomas Aquinas has taken up in a characteristic discussion. Thomas is engaged in the task of deriving the transcendentia, those characters of being which lie beyond every possible way in which an entity may be classified as coming under some generic kind of subject matter, every modus specialis entis, and which belong necessarily to anything, whatever it may be. Thomas has to demonstrate that the verum is such a transcendence. He does this by invoking an entity which, in accordance with its very manner of being, is properly suited to come together with entities of any sort whatever. This distinctive entity, the ens quod natum est convenire cum omni ente, is the soul, anima. Here, the priority of Dasein over all other entities emerges, although it has not been ontologically clarified. The priority has obviously nothing in common with a vicious subjectivizing of the totality of entities. A vicious subjectivizing of the totality of entities. By indicating Dasein's ontological priority in this provisional manner, we have grounded our demonstration that the question of being is ontico-ontologically distinctive. But when we analyze the structure of this question as such, Section 2, we came up against a distinctive way in which this entity functions in the very formulation of that question. Dasein then revealed itself as that entity which must first be worked out in an ontologically adequate manner. If the inquiry is to become a transparent one, but now it has been shown that the ontological analytic of Dasein in general is what makes up fundamental ontology, so that Dasein functions as that entity which in principle is to be interrogated beforehand as to its being. Yeah, this feels like bullshit, but it has a plot to it. It's like Twin Peaks. If to interpret the meaning of being becomes our task, Dasein is not only the primary entity to be interrogated, it is also the entity which already comports itself in its being towards what we are asking about when we ask this question. But in that case, the question of being is nothing other than the radicalization of an essential tendency of being, which belongs to Dasein itself, the pre-ontological understanding of being. And now that's part 2. I'm going to take a shower. This video better still be running or I'm going to kill myself. That's good. So, in the end, this might take probably less than 4 hours. Because, but still, I read at a relatively slow pace. I probably read faster when I'm reading without talking. But 50 pages, or 60 pages about. 60 pages is how much of the book? 500. A lot of that is not really the book. 563. Where does the book end? 453. Around. What's the ending sentence of this bullshit? It's like ending page. Ending paragraph. Something like being has been disclosed in the understanding of being which belongs to existent Dasein as a way in which it understands. Being has been disclosed in a preliminary way, although non-conceptually. And this makes it possible for Dasein as existent being in the world to comport itself toward entities, toward those which it encounters within the world, as well as towards itself in existent. How is this disclosive understanding of being at all possible for Dasein? Can this question be answered by going back to the primordial constitution of being, of that Dasein by which being is understood? The existential ontological constitution of Dasein's totality is grounded in temporality, hence the ecstatical projection of being must be made possible by some primordial way in which ecstatical temporality temporalizes. How is this mode of temporalizing of temporality to be interpreted? Is there a way which leads from primordial time to the meaning of being? Does time itself manifest as the horizon of being? What a great final page. I get it. Yeah. If he doesn't get that, it must be a fucking retard. 488. So 60 pages, or like 63 about. 67 would be about a seventh, I think. Yeah, about a seventh. A seventh of the whole book. I'm gonna take a shower. That sounds like someone already is. I'm gonna kill myself again. I'm your average fucking child molester. I'm more of a child molester than any average child molester you've ever seen. I'm not good. What, is the book going to be like 30 minutes longer just because I have pauses? Big deal. You can just listen through it. I'm still talking. I'm still on YouTube. It's a magical domain where if you're talking, you're still talking, and you're still making YouTube videos. So people are like, why are you still talking? Shut the fuck up.
50 words using that, maybe less. It's wordy, but it's the same 50 fucking words. Existence, being, time, historicality, historiology, historicity, histrionic, messianic, Masonic temple, messian, shalom, chutzpah, shalom, chutzpah. There's a chance we can make it down. Damn. Man, have you ever heard of ASMR? I haven't heard of this ASMR shit. I've heard of ASMR. She's everywhere. I don't even know how ASMR got up there. Speaking of this shit. ASMR? You ever heard of ASMR? She's real popular right now, ASMR. Swans, to be kind, to be grind, to be grinds, to be grind, to be from the near sea of these. Oh my god. Reading is bad for you. To be kind. Was that the right yeah, that's right. Not only, however, does an understanding of being belong to Dasein, but this understanding